All right, so tonight we'll be talking about Masada. So I don't know how many of you have done some research on Masada or know much about it. I really, before I watched the Masada movie, I didn't know a whole lot about it. But it is really interesting. So tonight we're going to be in the Judean desert. You can see, this is just from the picture here, down here, around the Dead Sea is Masada. I know that's real small right there, but it's right there if you can see it on the picture. Let me get you a little closer. We were in Gedi, we're in Qumran earlier. Here's Masada way down south of the Dead Sea. I want you to notice how far En-Gedi is away from Masada. That's going to become important here in just a few minutes as we talk. So let me show you a picture as we drove up to Masada, what it looked like. This is Masada. So right out here is Masada. So we're pretty far away. Let me kind of get you a little closer. This is parking in the parking lot, okay? Before you go up to Masada, this is where you are, okay? The left side is where one of Herod's palaces is. We'll talk about that in a minute. You can see right in the middle there, that's the Roman siege ramp. So you're gonna see a lot of stuff tonight on this. Now let me just tell you, the top of Masada is 23 acres. 23 acres on top of Masada. In the Old Testament, it was probably used as kind of a runaway a spot for criminals and people with something to hide. They would go up there to hide. There's been some evidence from the Iron Age on top of Masada, actually. We do see a couple references with the life of David that he was in. This is called the wilderness of Ziph. He was here as Saul was chasing him. We see that in 1 Samuel 23. We see in 1 Chronicles 6, okay? And scholars think that there's a great chance he was actually up on Masada at that time. Now, this is before Herod built all kinds of stuff up there. It was just a big, huge rock at that time. But the Hebrew word, actually, for fortress that is used for when Saul is chasing David is Masada. Okay, so David says, "You are my Masada." This is just a great picture of what he says. God, this is what you are to me, this huge fortress, my safety net. So on the right side over here, there's a wadi that separates Masada from other rock. By the way, this was used in the movie. These pictures of we'll get back to that. This is just the order of the pictures we're in. But there you can see on the right side that big, huge wadi. That's what separates Masada. Now, the Herod, the thing that gives really Masada its name and why people know so much about it is because of Herod. Between the years of 37 BC and 31 BC, he had a fortress built on Masada. Now, Herod had 7 palaces. This is one of his 7 in Israel, okay? This is just one of them. But understand, Herod is not Jewish. Herod was not a Jew. He was king of the Jews. He was an Idumean. He was from Idumea, okay? He was Idumean. Now, he was named king of the Jews by the Roman overlords. So this was a fortress that he built for himself. He built this one for himself. Now, I want you to think about the problem as you look at this huge, dry desert land here. If you look at this, how on earth are you going to live on top of a rock in the middle of a desert right next to a Dead Sea that has more salt than any place in the world? How are you going to have water? What are you going to do? Well, that was a problem. So there's no source of water on top of Masada. There's not a creek up there. There's nothing like that. So what he did was he built these cisterns. And so down low here, you can see kind of these roads. I don't know if you can see that from where you are, but down here, that's a road. They lead into 12 enormous cisterns that held water, okay? Now, not only that, I told you there's a wadi that separated Masada from the mountain beside it. He built, and you're going to see this in a minute, I'm going to try to show you a picture. He built a dam, he built a wall there, and he funneled the water all the way down from way in the distance, all the way down into these huge cisterns at the bottom of Masada. So then he has at least some water there that can be collected. From there, he built 14 cisterns on top of Masada. There's not a great way of getting the water from the lower cistern to the top cistern. So guess what he did? He had slaves in their job all day long, bucket of water, take it up to the top cistern, let it go all the way back down, get some more water, all the way back up in the heat in the desert. That was their job, okay? They estimate that he had to have had about 10,000 workers to have this thing running. 10,000 people. Now, imagine that being your job. That's all you did all day long, was to get water from the lower cistern and take it to the upper cistern. Now, after Herod's death, just to kind of tell you where this Masada came from, Masada fell to the Romans after Herod's death. Okay, so the Romans had a small garrison on top of Masada, and they guarded the salt miners in the area. In 67 AD is when you have the Jewish Revolt. Okay, and under the cover of darkness, the zealots, which we've mentioned briefly, zealots went up to the top of the Masada and assassinated the Roman soldiers that were up there, and they turned Masada into a hideout for themselves. Okay, so we'll talk about that story of the siege and all that stuff tonight, and talk about that siege ramp. By the way, that siege ramp was built around 73 AD. Just to kind of give you a time reference, about 73 AD. So I want you to hear this. There's two stories going on right here. There's the story of Herod, and there's the story of the Zealots and the Jewish Revolt. Okay, and they don't interlap. Okay, Herod died well before the Zealots and the Revolt. But we're going to do our best tonight to kind of talk about both of them, because they're both really, really important. So I want you to see, if I can get to this picture. By the way, here's some pictures of the ramp. Okay, right here, in the distance, and I wish this was a little bit clearer, right in there, okay, I don't know if you can see my pointer, right in there is En-Gedi. Okay, let me show you a little better picture. This is from top of Masada. You're going to see this picture again in a few minutes. Way over here in the distance is En-Gedi. Now, why is that important? That's 24 miles away, and that is the closest freshwater source. When the Romans were down on the bottom, in the hot sun, and they needed water, guess where they had to go to get it? 24 miles away to En-Gedi. 24 miles away, okay? So let me show you that in this picture, if you can see right here where my pointer is, that is the dam that Herod had built, so that when the water came down, it would dam up right there, and he funneled that water into those 12 huge, and I'm talking huge, cisterns on the bottom of Masada. You know, when they were excavating this in around 1968, they were skeptical. Could this really work? Could water actually be funneled down and go into those cisterns? And then one day it flooded miles. It came a rain quite a few miles away, and the beginning of that water channel started working, all the way to where the Romans built that huge siege ramp, and they said, "Oh, yes, it does work." So anyway, yeah, it's incredible. It's incredible. Now, so that's kind of story number one of Herod. Story number two: Zealots were up at the top of the Masada. Romans came to destroy them. They built that big siege ramp that you saw a minute ago. This right here. They built this huge sea ramp. The Romans were not going to let the Zealots escape. I mean, because there's some history there, and I could go into it, but it would just take too long. But just know there's a reason why they were not going to let them escape. And so they started that siege ramp in 70 AD and completed it in 73 AD. It took 3 years, and it is incredible. If they have steps, so you walk right beside there, and just how much earth they had to move to make this ramp without using any modern equipment or anything like that. It's incredible. It is incredible. So the archaeologists did find some remains, by the way, on Masada when they excavated. And so as you travel up Masada, I want you to see this picture. If I can get to it. Here we are traveling up Masada. They do have a tram, by the way. You don't have to climb it like we did. Let me show you. Over to the left in this picture, you see that little hill? If I go over one more, you can see kind of a panoramic. Right in here is a hill. They took the remains that they found during their excavation, and they buried them and made a monument right there to the Jews that in the revolt. And so you can actually stop right there, and that's a monument there. So So why did they build the siege ramp? This is the side opposite of the Dead Sea. This is not the way you would go up. This is not the way the Zealots went up. There was what they called a snake path on the other side. That was the road that was already there. So why did the Romans build the siege ramp on the side they did? Well, it's because it's only about 800 feet from bottom to top on this side. On the other side, it's about 1,800 feet. So it's about 1,000 feet higher up if they would have done it on the existing road. So it would have taken years and years longer. So it would have been a huge problem. So that's why they did where they did that where they did. Now, not only, we talked about a minute ago that they had to bring water, the Roman soldiers, all the way from En-Gedi. I want you to understand that the Romans had 30,000 soldiers around Masada to try to get to the Zealots. 30,000. And they had to keep that water coming from En-Gedi the whole time. And we know a few things. Josephus says that you had 3 legions, mainly, of the Roman legions that were stationed there. One was the 10th Legion, that's the Marines, okay, to them. One is the 12th Legion, and they were a notoriously brutal Egyptian unit. And the third Legion was the 15th, and that was the one who were the engineers, and they were able to design ramps, design all these different things that were needed, the battering rams, things like that. So Josephus told us that. Well, guess what? When they excavated, they found arrowheads that confirm it was the 10th Legion, the 12th Legion, and the 15th Legion that the Romans had, because each legion had different arrowheads. And so based on that, scholars know Josephus was exactly right what he said, okay? So they know he's right on the money. Let me kind of show you. Remember those catapults that was in the movie? Those catapults right there. They're just camped out at the beginning as you go in. They used, those are the battering rams. But look down here. In the movie, for those of you that have seen it, you have this scene where the Romans are taking family members of people that are on top, that are already slaves, and they were using catapults and throwing them into the side of the mountain there to their death, saying, hey, if you don't want to come down, your father is about to die. And seeing them throw against that mountainside. Just so you know, did that really happen? We have no idea. There is no records that it happened at Masada. However, we do know that that's one of the big ploys the Romans used in warfare. It likely happened there just because of that's the way the Romans played. That's what they did. Okay, so now let me show you something else from this picture up high. Sorry, I'm going back and forth on some of these pictures. I want you to see a few things though. From up high, you can see some stones like right in here that are still kind of in squares and they have walls around them. Those are original from that revolt. Okay, they're still there. They're still there. You can see those. That's where the camps were of the 15th unit. That's where Flavius Silva, all the people that you hear about if you watch the Masada, that's where they camped. It was right at the base. You can still see it today. That one down there, the first one there is called Camp Number 1. And that camp, by the way, was divided in half. Half of it was what they considered the praetorium for Flavius Silva, the Roman commander, and the other half was used for housing and things. So now I want to get you in the story here. Imagine that you're here in 70 AD during the Jewish Revolt. Okay, 70 AD, the temple in Jerusalem has fallen. It's no longer. Okay, 1 million Jews have already been killed out of 2.5. 1 million out of 2.5 million have already, almost half of the Jews in Israel have already been killed. Today that would be like 180 million Americans have been killed. Okay? Many of the Jews who have not been killed have been sold into slavery. Okay, so they're in slavery. Scholars are not sure exactly, by the way, who built the ramp of Masada. You see in the movie some different things. Those are theories. Those are not proven on exactly what happens. I think it's really well done in the movie. But some have concluded that Jewish slaves likely built the ramp. But here's the problem. That's what you see in the movie. The problem with that is Most scholars actually believe the soldiers built the ramp because Romans paid their soldiers by giving them slaves. They didn't have enough money. They had 30,000 soldiers. How are you going to pay 30,000 people to do their job? So what they did was they originally gave them land, but then they started giving them slaves. That's how they paid them. Was here's one of the people we captured. Have fun with that. You know, here's a slave for you. And so here's the thing. The slaves were typically sold off for the money. So they didn't usually put them to work like we might think. Most of the time, they're like, okay, here's a slave. Who are going to give me some money for this slave? And they sell them. That's how they make their money. That's how they make their living. So how many slaves were there? We don't know. We don't know. Those are wild guesses. Anytime you hear that, those are just guesses. So now, at the same time they were building this siege ramp, by the way, this is interesting. The Roman army had another project going on during those 3 years. They built a 5-mile long wall that was 6 feet wide and 8 feet tall all the way around Masada. So they built this huge wall. You can actually see it, and it's hard in this picture, but when you get up there with your eyes, you can see the wall that they built at the same time. It's incredible. It goes up on the mountainside over here. It's just incredible. Can you imagine? We were there in May, and it was really hot. But July, August, it's 20 degrees warmer than what it was when we were there that day. And I'm telling you, I didn't want to be out in it. It's one of those days where you're trying to drink some of the water and it's already like 90 degrees hot, and you're watering, that just tastes horrible. Because it was just so hot, and it's 20 degrees warmer later in the year. So if you see in the movie, some of you have seen it, you hear one of the Jews say this on top of Masada. He says, we're not going to lose. He says, the Roman army is down there where a lizard can't even live during the summer. They're down there where even a lizard can't live. We're going to win up here, right? But it was incredible because the Roman army, they stayed down there, even in the summer, year-round for years, building that siege ramp. Now, on top of Masada, Herod built this wall. And I'm going to show you. By the way, this is when you get to the top of Masada. Sorry, I keep on thinking it's back here. When you get to the top of Masada, this is kind of just a drawing that we had of kind of where everything was. You have a northern palace over here. You have storehouses. You have a western palace. You see a pool, and we're going to get into that. But you see this wall all the way around it. Okay, this wall all the way around it. Now, I want you to see this. This is up top. Okay, and by the way, that's looking down over that siege ramp. Pretty incredible. This right here is the wall he built. Okay, it's called a casemate wall. Okay, it's called a casemate wall. This wall, it was 24 to 30 feet wide, and it was 24 feet high. Huge. Can you imagine coming up along this huge Masada, this huge rock, and then seeing a wall 24 feet high? But then you get up there and you see that it's 24 to 30 feet wide. And when the revolt came, by the way, it was still there. Now, this is a picture in between the two walls. It had an outer, and that's casemate, an outer and an inner wall. And this comes important in the story, an outer and an inner wall. Okay? So as you go up the siege ramp, we stood in the middle of this talking about the story. And so the Romans were building this ramp, and the Zealots were thinking, okay, they're coming up here, they're building this huge ramp, and they're going to try to knock down our wall. So what'd they do? If you watch the movie, they went and they basically plundered the palaces with Herod's huge. He had some wood ceilings and that sort of thing. They plundered the wood out and they put it in between the two walls. Because they said whenever they try to use that battering ram and hit the wall, if there's all this wood, it'll bounce straight back. They won't be able to knock down the wall. So that was kind of whenever it looked like, okay, they're getting up here pretty close, what are we going to do? That's what they did, okay? That's what they did. Now, in actuality, the Romans, if you watch the movie, you'll see this, they built this huge battering ram that was much taller than the Zealots thought. So the Zealots thought they still had some more time because the ramp has to get higher to make a battering ram to actually get into it. Well, guess what? They just made a battering ram that was 5 stories tall. Huge. so they could climb up the battering ram. And so all of a sudden, one night, they start up with this huge battering ram. And we'll get into the story more. But they did it sooner than the Jews thought possible. By the way, they built the battering ram over the hill, on its side. So the Jews had no idea. I mean, the Zealots had no idea what was going on down there based on where they built this thing. They pulled it to the top of that ramp using a pulley system. That's how they did it. But they surprised the Zealots is what happened. Now, the Zealots, that's when they stripped the timbers off of Herod's palaces. By the way, there are three. He has 3 palaces on top of Masada. They put these cedar timbers between these casemate walls. And again, the idea was to get more protection. And guess what? It worked. Their thought worked. It did provide more protection. But then the Romans had a decision to make. Again, if you watch the movie, and I suggest all of you watch this at some point, you see this. They talked about, should we set fire to the wood? Now, I want you to think about it. What happens if the wind comes back at them and they have a wooden battering ram that they've been building right there beside it? It's going to catch everything on fire. And so Flavius Silva had a decision to make. Do we burn it? Do we burn the wood? Or what's our next move? Again, if you watch the movie, it's a pretty distinct scene where he just says, burn it. And guess what? That's what they did. So this is one of my favorite scenes, actually. When they set it on fire, the wind started coming from the east initially. And it started driving the soldiers out of the battering ram. The Zealots began to celebrate, saying, God has delivered us. God has delivered us. And just when they started thinking that they had the victory, the wind changed back from the west. And all of that fire got on the beams, and it did exactly what the Romans were trying to do. It burned all night long. Those cedars in the middle of that casemate walls, they burned all night long. When they excavated that area that you can stand on right at the top of that siege ramp, when they excavated that area, they found more than 9,000 sling stones. They found more than 9,000 arrowheads, because there was an intense battle right there. Incredibly intense battle. They found charred embers of cedar wood that backs up that historical count perfectly. During the revolt, there were 969 people on top of Masada. 969 people. Only about 350 of them were actually trained soldiers, though. So most of them weren't. Most of them were kids and wives and things like that. So only 350 really knew what they were doing to even fight off this 30,000 unit Roman army. Many of the people just couldn't do anything when the actual battle began. So only 5 people survived. 5 out of the 969 that were on top. 5 people survived. And they were servants. They hid in one of those 14 cisterns we talked about earlier. They hid in one of those cisterns. And that's how they survived. Josephus, by the way, interviewed those 5 people to get the story so that he could give the account to us. So how do we know all these details? Well, Josephus talked to the 5 that stayed alive, that hid in the cisterns, and that's how we know what happened. That's how we know the details. Now, I want to show you a few things of what Herod built up here. By the way, this is standing on right where I am right here. This is on top of where that siege ramp is. And I'm in the middle of the casemate walls right there as I'm standing there taking that picture. Now, Herod's palace, just everything up there, it's incredible, even today. And it's nothing like it was when he built it, okay? And so we're going to talk about that. So there's all these huge, so what happened was 14 cisterns. They took the huge stones out of those cisterns to make the walls. How did they have all that stuff? They took the cisterns, that's how they made those walls. Now, for those of you that are going, pay attention to something. I think I have some pictures here you're going to notice. There are some, when you see black lines, any excavation in Israel, not just Masada, if you see a line, okay, like a lot of times they're black, sometimes they're white, you'll notice them, you can't miss them. Anything below that line is completely original. Exactly the way it was found. Nothing has been changed. This stone was there. So like when you go to places, say that Jesus was or that sort of thing, and you see that line, you see those stones, saying this is exactly where those stones were and the exact stones when Jesus was here, right? Masada is the same way. You see these lines in different places. Anything above that has been reconstructed to try to match what the original was. But it had been knocked down. There was an earthquake in the 2nd century that knocked down some things on Masada. So some of that stuff was knocked down. Well, they had to put it back together. So that's what those lines are for. And if I think about it, I'll show you a picture of that in a few minutes. So pay attention to that when you see it. Every wall on Masada, and this is amazing. This is Herod. Every wall on Masada, inside and out, was plastered white. You see that down here, plastered white. And this is a recreation. You're going to see some original on Masada in his throne room. And I'll show you in a few minutes. I have a picture of original plaster that he had put. Every wall, 24 feet. Just imagine as you come up on Masada and you see this huge plastered, pearly white wall on top of this mountain, shining in the sunlight. It must have been incredible. Incredible. Everything was plastered. Now, there's two places you're going to see originals when you go there. There are two places you're going to see the original plaster. Now, what happened? And I want to go through some things with you, and we did it here. And I'm going to take you. I need to give you some of this because it knocked my socks off, and I think it's really, really good, and I think it fits. So I'm going to go through with you, and this is something that doesn't necessarily completely pertain to Masada, but I think it does help us understand the story. So I want to take us through what happened between the end of the Old Testament in the beginning of the New Testament. And I know we've done that. Bert's done that with sermons. He's done an awesome job taking us through. We've done some of those things in classes. But I want to take you through, why on earth do you see at the end of the Old Testament, there's nothing called a Sadducee, there's nothing called a Pharisee, there's nothing called a synagogue, there's nothing called a rabbi. And then we pick up with Jesus, and all of a sudden you see Sadducees and Pharisees and synagogues and rabbis and all these things. Well, I want to go through the history of that tonight, okay? And it's going to come into our story later on, okay? In 586 BC, the Jewish people went into captivity in Babylon, okay? 586 BC, okay? While they were there, two things began to evolve: rabbis and synagogues. As they were away from their temple, that's when you started to see rabbis and synagogues and during that Babylonian captivity. So it was a way to preserve their Jewishness when they were in exile. Okay? So if I tell you captivity, I want you to think about rabbis and synagogues. That's what happened. Captivity, rabbis and synagogues. Okay? Number two, about 100 years later, okay, a small, and this kind of evolved. These are just kind of some numbers that you don't have to remember. A small group of those people started to come back. It was a return from captivity. When they got back to Israel, they were told by the Persians, who basically ruled the whole world at that time, that they may be a Jewish kingdom in Israel, okay, but they have to be ruled by a high priest. As long as they answer to the high priest, then Jews, you can have your own kingdom when you get back to Israel. Okay, that was the demands of the Persians. So they got back from exile. They no longer had a king, like you see at the end of the Old Testament, right? They no longer had a king as they went off into captivity. Instead, they have a high priest that rules them. The priestly party that ruled was called the Sadducees. That's the first time you see Sadducees. That's the high priestly party that ruled them, Sadducees. So if I say return from exile, if I say return, you should be thinking Sadducees. That's when you see that group of people, okay? Number three, life goes on. The Jewish people were ruled by a high priest. He was a Sadducee, like we said, okay? Alexander the Great shows up. We talked about him a couple weeks ago. He shows up in 334 BC, Alexander the Great. So the Greeks arrive. You remember Decapolis. You remember Scythopolis, right? Israel became a Greek kingdom at that time. Okay, after Alexander the Great dies, his successors, and this is very much made to elementary school level, but just to get our mind around things, Ptolemies and the Seleucids. Okay, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids are when you start seeing them. I'm just giving you some names. You don't have to remember them. We have discussed some of this in the past, but the Greek mindset was, if we build it, they will come. They're going to love the way we live, right? That's what we talked about with Decapolis. So they planted these Greek cities all over the place. The Jews saw their culture crumbling before their very eyes. Can you imagine if you're a Jew and you see your culture absolutely crumbling before your very eyes? That was happening. So a group of Jews became a movement of people who became so devoted to Torah. It says we're going to know every word of Torah and we're going to live it out to the letter of the law because we see our world crumbling. They called themselves Hasidim. Hasidim, H-A-S-I-D-I-M, Hasidim. So if I tell you Greek, you think Hasidim. Hasidim, okay? Number 4. There's a Jewish revolt against the Greek authorities led by the Maccabees. You've heard of the Maccabees, okay? The Greeks were driven out. And by the way, that was truly a miracle, because if you look at the numbers, that shouldn't have happened. So God had, without God's assistance, it could not have happened. So the Maccabees were from the priestly line. They were in the Sadducee class. Maccabees are priestly line people, okay? They were Sadducees. The first 3 Maccabees, they have a bad name, and we'll get to that, were actually people that followed God's way. They were good guys. They followed the way God told them to do it. Then came a Maccabee called Alexander Yanni. Okay, Alexander Yanni. Now, you don't take the name Alexander unless you really want to be Greek. Alexander's a Greek name. You have this priestly Maccabee who all of a sudden has the name Alexander, Greek. Okay? He was into stuff. He was into pleasure. He was into Decapolis stuff that we talked about a couple weeks ago. So at this time, you see a split in the Sadducee class. You see a split in the Sadducees. A few of them got fed up with how Hellenistic and corrupt their priesthood had become. Okay? And they split off and went to the desert to form their own priesthood. Any idea what their names were? They were the Essenes. Okay? They were from the Sadducee class that got fed up with the Hellenistic lifestyle and they split. So they were the ones who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls like we talked about a few weeks ago. So if I say Maccabees, you think Essenes. Essenes. So at the same time, the Hasidim, that class of people, okay, that the Essenes came off of, you had another group of people who says, we're going to fight. We are going to fight the Greeks. We're not going down with a fight. Anyone that's influenced by the Greek lifestyle, anybody that, even if you're a Jew, I don't care, I'm going to fight you. Any idea what their names were? They were called the Zealots. They were the Zealots. Okay? So this other group, the Zealots, they said, you have the Essenes that says, we're going to work to be righteous and God will take care of us. Okay? The Zealots were completely opposite. The Zealots said, you know what? We're going to fight. We're going to fight. Now, just making sure I have everything in here. Now, we see one more group of people that come off that class, okay? It was a group of people that says that if we're righteous enough, God will take care of the Sadducee class, and they call themselves the pure ones, or in Hebrew, the prushim. We say Pharisees. So it's at that time, the Maccabees, okay, so Sadducee class has already been developed. Okay, that's the priestly class. It's at that time where there's this split, and you see these groups of people starting to form with the Zealots and the Essenes, and then you see the Pharisees that say, we are going to know God's word, and we're going to let him take care of our enemies. That's the Pharisees. Okay, Pharisees. Now, number 5. I know this is getting confusing. We're almost there to Jesus, okay? Last part of this. 63 BC. 63 BC. 2 brothers who are Maccabees had this civil war, okay, for the priesthood. And you don't need to know the names. I'm not even going to get into it. One of them was a weaker of the 2 brothers, and he needed help, so he went to Rome and says, will you help me fight my brother? Will you help me fight my brother? So a Roman commander, Pompey, came to Israel in 63 BC. He turned Israel into a Roman province. Okay? Now, they said they wanted to have a king instead of a high priest. We want to have a king, not a high priest. So they picked an Idumean. An Idumean. You should hear these words. He's from Idumea, from Petra. His name was Antipater. I don't know if you ever heard of the name Antipater. Okay? Why do you need to know this? Antipater was not Jewish, but he is now king of the Jews. Antipater was king of the Jews, and he was given the Roman power to enforce whatever he said. Okay? Now, Pompey, the Roman commander, is in this civil war with Julius Caesar. You know some of these names. Julius Caesar chases Pompey all the way to Egypt. The Egyptians kill him, put his head in a jar, and presented it to Julius Caesar when he arrived. They were hoping Julius Caesar would say, thank you very much, and go to Rome, okay? Now, instead, Julius Caesar was mad. How dare you kill him? Okay? Now, he hung around Egypt for a while. He fell in love with a queen named Cleopatra. He fell in love with Cleopatra. Problem was, Cleopatra's brother was in power. So one day, Caesar, Cleopatra, and a legion of soldiers they had were trapped inside Cleopatra's palace in Alexandria in Egypt. Okay? It looked like it was the end for Julius Caesar. He sent messages to his province in Israel for help. And guess who came? Antipater. Antipater, the one that was given all that power. Antipater's men fought their way into the palace. He rescued Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was so grateful. This is where Herod comes into play. He told Antipater that he would forever be the king of the Jews. Okay? 3 years later, Antipater died. His son, Herod, became king of the Jews. So if I say Roman, that's the time that Herod gets introduced to the story. I give you all that background, okay, for a few reasons. You need to understand Herod, where he came from. He was not a Jew. He was Idumean, okay? The Jews hated Herod. Hated him. He wasn't one of them. Hated him, okay? He was the richest man in the world, and nobody could stand the guy. The Hellenists hated him because he was king and they weren't. The religious Jews hated him because he was just a disgusting human being, which we'll talk about. For instance, Herod would be known to travel down the road in a caravan, see a beautiful woman, have his men bring that woman into his carriage, do whatever he wanted to with her, and then just kick her out of the side of the road and keep going. That's Herod. That's Herod. And this man became the king of God's chosen people, the Jews. I said a minute ago, Herod built 7 palaces. I want you to understand, his smallest palace was 17 acres. That's his smallest. His largest was over 60 acres in size. okay? 3 of them were built along the same wadi. This is important. One in Jerusalem, one in Bethlehem, and one in Masada. Why? If you look across, and I don't have it right here, if you look across the sea, over the Dead Sea, and you'll see a picture of this, from Masada, guess what Herod could see? Idumea, his home. He built palaces for an escape route because everybody hated him. So he built them along a wadi so he can go from this palace to this palace, that palace to that palace. And when he gets to Masada, he's home free. He's right beside Idumea. So that's what he did. Just some other things about Herod. He ruled for 37 years. He had 9 wives. 2 of them, by the way, he was recorded as killing. One of them was named Miriam. We're going to talk about her more in a minute. She was a Jew. He had one Jewish wife that was from the priestly line. That becomes important, okay? He had one Jewish wife. She was recorded, by the way, as the most beautiful woman in the world. One day, Herod had to go out to tend to an issue to a country in the east. Now, this just shows you how disgusting Herod was. So he's told by the Romans, Herod, you got to go, there's an issue over here in the east, you've got to go deal with it, okay? So he's going to leave his wife. Okay? Herod was afraid that he was going to be killed in this war. So he gave an order. He didn't want his wife with anybody else. Okay? So, and by the way, that drove him crazy. He didn't want his wife with anybody else. He didn't want anybody else to marry Miriam. He left an order to kill her if he was killed. He says, if I die, she dies. Okay? Now, Herod was not killed. When he returned, somehow Miriam found out about the order. Can you imagine that conversation? So, that's the first day back. He found out that Miriam knew what the order was. Herod said, how on earth could Miriam have found out about that order? He said, she must have had an affair while I was gone. This guy was crazy. He said, she must have had an affair while I was gone. So he tortured 25,000 people to death. 25,000 in an attempt to have somebody confess that they had an affair with Miriam. They confessed all kinds of stuff that nobody knew about, but nobody confessed to having an affair with his wife because nobody did. He was crazy. Now listen, it gets worse. If you think that's bad. Herod threw a banquet. The guest of honor, surprisingly, was his wife, Miriam. Sounds like a sweet gesture. She sat on a throne, okay, in the middle of the crowd. As dinner began, they tied her to a chair, and they put a garrote around her neck. With each course, when it was served, they twisted the garrote. The guests slowly watched Miriam strangled to death before their very eyes during that banquet. This is Herod. This is the king of the Jews. You can see why everybody hated him. Now, later, you're going to hear some more Herod stories. Herod is dying a horrible death, and it's some nasty stuff going on. I don't want to die the way he died. Just say that. He's in Jericho, okay, which you'll be going to, in his palace at Jericho. Someone told him, here's what they told him. Herod, it's sad that when you die, nobody's going to mourn. That drove Herod crazy, even crazier. So, he had them round up 5,000 people, Israelites from all over Israel, okay? And he says, I want you to lock all these people in Jericho, into an arena in Jericho. And as soon as I die, give an order to kill all 5,000. Israel may not mourn for me, but they're going to mourn the moment I die. So, one day, it looked like he died. His son thought he's dead. He's not responding. The order was given for 5,000 to die. But when his son saw that his father was completely dead, he said, stop. Stop the killing. Because he said, the Romans are never going to appoint me as king of the Jews if I've slaughtered 5,000 people. Well, guess what? Turns out Herod was not dead. Herod had another banquet. This time, his son was suspended on a throne above a fire. With each course of the banquet, his son was lowered into the burning fire. So as the people sat there in horror and disbelief, hearing his son burned to death, that was the banquet. This is Herod. Now, I got to get you there for a reason, because the Bible says, I think it's Matthew 2, says, in the days of Herod the king, Jesus was born. Why is that important? Well, if you don't understand Herod, you don't understand how big that is. Now, we're going to get back to that. We need to shift gears to the Zealots again, okay? Get back on to 70 AD Zealots, okay? Because I want to pick up the Zealot story. Herod died. People absolutely hated Herod's sons, by the way. There were 3 Herod's sons were given different parts of Israel, and we can talk about that anytime. If you have questions, we can talk about it. But there's this constant flow of terrorism in Israel. One Roman writer said that the Romans sent their kids home in jars for 75 years. There was that much just terrorist attacks all over the country. Then the revolt happened. The revolt started in Galilee. The Roman army and had just demolished the country. Jerusalem fell. The temple was burned. But there was a little band of Jews up on Masada. The Zealots came from Gamla. We've showed pictures. Remember the Sea of Galilee? And we said top left is the triangle, top right are the Zealots in Gamla. Remember that? They came from right there, okay? The leadership of the group was called Eleazar ben Yair. He was from Gamla, okay? Nero, the Roman emperor, had just died, and the new emperor, his name was Vespasian. His son was the leader of the army against the Jewish Revolt, okay? Vespasian's son was the army against the Jewish Revolt. Vespasian, again, I wish I could get into all this tonight, held what they called a Roman triumph, proclaiming, I am Lord and God. I am king. That's a Roman triumph. And Vespasian had just proclaimed that. The problem is, Vespasian, there's still a group of Jews on top of Masada. You haven't really completely defeated all of them yet, buddy. So Vespasian was never going to let those 969 people escape. He didn't care what it took. They were going to die. That revolt was going to end. So the siege of Masada took 3 years. We talked about that a minute ago. By the way, this picture right here is what is called Bet Sefer. This is Torah school, Bet Sefer for the Jew. So right here, you had Jewish boys studying the Bible while the Romans were down at the bottom laying siege. The Romans built that ramp and battering ram we showed you earlier. Now, it was Passover evening when it became clear that the Jews were not going to win. Passover evening, okay? That's when the timbers were burning. The commander assembled them. Now, you got to hear his speech. It's on the movie. But listen to Eleazar ben Yair. These are his words. Josephus recorded them from the people that were up there. Okay? Here's what he said as he knew for sure we're not going to win this war. He said this, brave and loyal Jews, long ago we vowed never to serve anyone but the Lord himself, and we will certainly never serve the Romans, for their commander calls himself Lord, and to do so would be idolatry. The time has come to prove this by our actions. We revolted first, and it is our great honor to be the last. God has given us this privilege, and we can choose to die as free men and women. Our enemies cannot prevent this, no matter how much they try. Our wives can die unmolested, our children without knowing the suffering of slavery. Let us do each other a great act of kindness that will be our freedom as a burial shroud. Let us burn the possessions in the fortress. It will be a bitter blow to the Romans when they find there is nothing here to loot, the thieves that they are. But let us spare our food so that it is clear we perish because we choose, rather than because they defeated us. We were born to die, all of us. Even the luckiest here will die. But the sight of our wives and children led away in shame to be used by the Romans are evils that no one should have to face. We will only face such a horrifying sight if we are cowards. Is anyone blind to what they are going to do? They have always been the most brutal people the world has ever known. Imagine their rage if they catch those who had defeated them in battle at every turn. You can run, they will catch you. You can hide, but they will find you. You can fight them and they will kill you or capture you. And what they will do to you then, no one should ever have to see. Pity your children whose bodies are strong enough to survive their prolonged torture. Pity the old whose bones will break immediately under their treatment. While our hands can hold a sword, let us do a noble act of devotion to God. Let us die unenslaved by God's enemies and leave this world as free people. He instructed anyone who thought he was right to gather their family, to say Shema, and to kill their children with their knife first. He had a butcher show them how to do it kosher. And then he instructed his zealots to go from house to house in case anyone was too afraid to do this to their children or to their wives. The zealots cast lots. They chose 10 men. These men went around to the other zealots and killed their friends. One of the 10 had to kill the other 9 and then commit suicide. When they excavated the palace, by the way, they found 10 pieces of pottery that had 10 Jewish names that they used for those lots. One of them was Eleazar ben Yair. So at midnight, all of a sudden, everything goes quiet on top of Masada. But I want you to think about it. This is 70 AD. See, I wonder if any of those men up there, when they were a young boy in Galilee, heard a rabbi say that if you live by the sword, you'll die by the sword. See, I tell you all these things because we need to appreciate the world that Jesus was born into. See, among his disciples, Jesus had a Roman tax collector, and he had Simon, the zealot. I imagine they had some pretty intense discussions. But until recently, this is something else that you might not know. Until recently, young Israelis would join the military right after they graduated high school, and they would run on top of Masada. You see that at the beginning of the movie Masada, okay? But I want you to hear this, because when they get to the top, they're given a Bible, and they're given a weapon. And when they get up there, they take an oath, and this is their oath. While I live, Masada will not fall again. See, the last time Masada fell, it led to exile for over 1,800 years for their people. So it's impossible to understand Israel today without understanding Masada, without understanding what happened in 70 AD. Now, with all that in mind, I want to show you some more pictures on top of Masada so you can kind of get a picture of what to expect. We're gonna transition and just show kind of a lot of this is more time of Herod. We're going to kind of close all this again in a minute. This is Herod's swimming pool on top of Masada. He had 7 on top of Masada, 7 swimming pools. This pool was 8 feet deep. The walls were plastered just like everything else in that white plaster. The bottom was mosaic. How did it get filled? See if you find the faucet there. It'd be pretty impressive if you did, because they didn't have one. It was filled by hand. Some poor servant had to go down to the bottom to the cistern, get some water out of a bucket, carry it up that snake trail, 1,800 feet, up to the top, pour it in one bucket at a time. Over and over and over. Now, Herod didn't like the water. We talked about this before. Herod was a desert man. Josephus says he could not stand the water. One of the places he had built, y'all will go to, is Caesarea on the Mediterranean. There's a good chance he either never went there or only went there the one time when it was kind of finished. Herod loved the desert. So most scholars think he spent most of his time on Masada, actually. It's the closest to Idumea, and he definitely spent a lot of time there. Now, think about that. Why would Herod have a pool on top of Masada if he didn't like the water? It's because he's Herod, and he wants to show the world, I am Herod. Look at my power. Look at my glory. I can build a pool, or actually 7, on top of a desert mountain if I want to, because I'm Herod. That's Herod. That's Herod. He wants to be the best and the most successful person on the planet. And just imagine, too, the day they get a little algae in here. And Herod says, okay, let's empty out that water and refill it with some fresh water. Show you another picture here. This is right outside. You can kind of see there's a ledge you can go to, and over it's beautiful to look at everything. This is the view from that spot. You can see the Dead Sea. Why do I keep doing that? You can see the Dead Sea in the background over here. It's dried up. It used to be up to where the Roman wall was back in Herod's day, Jesus' day, all the way up to the wall. Okay? Now, but this right here, you can see right across. See right, and I have a better picture. Right over here was the Roman outlook post. The lookout post that during that siege, you see in the movie, the Romans stationed some people up there, and there's still rocks. You can still see it. There's rocks up there from where they stationed to see what the Jews were doing. That's how they knew that they're playing in the swimming pool and they're doing all kinds of stuff. It's because they had spies up there to watch the zealots. And by the way, I wish that my audio worked. This is just some more pictures. Here's what it looks like. Yeah, that's where the Roman the lookout post was, right there. I have and then right down here you can see some of the Roman forts and stuff. I have this right here. I wish it would play, but it's not going to play because there's no audio to it. But you can scream a word right there. We did it in unison right here. And the words come right back to you. You can hear like you're right next door. So guess what? When those Roman soldiers were on that post over there, they can talk back and forth. You can hear them clear as day. Clear as day. Just based on the topography. You can hear them so clearly. Let me show you a picture. This is just on top. You can see there's a lot of area where you can walk, 23 acres. We're going down to a cistern right here. So this is one of the 14 cisterns on top. So you can see how large it is. It is huge. Okay? One of 14. This is the 4th from the largest. Okay? The 4th from the largest. One is actually double this size. Just making sure you can see. Okay. One is actually double that size. Now, of the 12 on the bottom, there is at least 3. There's one that's at least 3 times this size. They are huge. Huge, huge, huge. Now, if Herod had all the cisterns filled on the bottom and the top, he had enough water to feed, or for 10,000 people for 10 years. Enough water for them to drink 10,000 people for 10 years. That's why he had so many cisterns built. They plastered, by the way, all of the walls inside the cisterns. When the zealots got to Masada, they found that all of these cisterns were completely full. That's why in the movie you see them just throwing water over the side to kind of taunt the Romans. Look, you're dying down there with no water. They're rationing water with the Romans because they don't have enough water coming from Engedi for 30,000. And you got all these zealots up there throwing water over the side to mock them and say, yeah, you should be up here where we are. It's a lot nicer. So, listen, they could have given enough water to the entire Roman army for that entire 3-year siege. That's how much water they had. They could have fed all 30,000 of the Roman soldiers for the entire siege. That's how much water they had. Tons. Herod had 2 bathhouses. He had 2 one is, this right here is his western palace. I told you he had 2 palaces. We're going to get into wine in just a minute. But look at the mosaic. It's incredible. Incredible. I know this picture isn't the best. I have another one right here that's not mine, but I wanted to find a better picture of it. It is incredible mosaic, and this is what Herod had put in, okay? If I keep going, we'll get back to this. This is his throne room, okay? We're going to get back to that. Down there, you see that right there is original. You see that original plaster? That's Herod's that he had put there. That's original. But this is just some of the places in the Western Palace. This right here was his bathhouse. Okay, this is where his bath. Do what? Yes, you see the black line on top there. So everything below is original. On top they reconstructed. Okay, so there's a black line right there. You see it. Thanks for pointing that out. Now, you see in this picture, this is Herod's shower. Okay, you see down here where he could sit. And you see a hole up here. He had his servants pour water in that for him to sit there and have a shower. They better get that water the right temperature. This right here is another place you can see. Right here, down here, is actually this oven. Why would you build an oven on top of a mosaic floor? The Zealots did it. They didn't care about the mosaics at that time. They were just trying to survive. And when it's cold at night, they built ovens wherever they could to burn a little wood to keep warm. And so the Zealots did that. By the way, I'm going to come back to this in just a second. I want to show you this picture if I can get to it. That right there's a bathtub, by the way. There was one in his palace too, but that's not very big, if you can see. It's a pretty small bathtub. Now, here's something else you need to get your mind around. The people at this time, for a man, was 5 foot to 5'2". Okay, that was the average height of a man. Now the average man weighed about 110 pounds. Average woman in Jesus' day was 4'10" to 5 feet. Okay, and they weighed about 100 pounds or a little less. Okay, so that's the size. So you have these small structures. So Herod was not a large man. Okay, let me go back to these over here again. So that right there, this is a picture to the entrance of his underground swimming pool. So he had an underground swimming pool, even though he didn't swim. That was just to say I'm Herod and I can do these sort of things. Now, let me get back to this is Herod's throne room, a little closer view with the original plastering that Herod had put there. If you wanted, now this is important in the story of Jesus, not Masada, but the idea of a throne room in a palace. Okay. If you want an audience with Herod, this is where you would meet him. You would stand out in the open. He is under a covered place with a raised stage on a throne. Okay, so he's elevated. You're down lower. You're in the elements. He's covered. He's comfortable. You're not. Okay? So just imagine if you didn't know how he was going to respond to whatever you're going to tell him, having to come to that. And he's raised right there, right? Now, think about the story of Jesus' birth. The wise men came to meet Herod in Jerusalem. They met him in a throne room. Just imagine Herod raised on a throne, the wise men down in the elements, okay? I just want to get you into the story to get you a visual. But there's a Hebrew idea here that I think we need to understand. See, the word in Hebrew for bless is barak, B-A-R-A-K, barak. Okay? What does barak actually mean? When we talk about, God, please bless me or whatever. We say these words, and we use words, we throw around words we don't really even know the meaning to, okay? Bless, that word literally means to lower myself to make somebody else greater. So, for instance, if I have somebody else up here that's taller than me, right? Or let's say they're shorter than me. You would say, I'm taller than they are. It's easy to bless because you're lower than somebody else. But the idea is, I lower myself to be a servant to that person. That's bless. That's barak. So when the Bible talks about God blessing us, what it's literally saying is he made himself into a servant, lowered himself in a way to serve us. And when we talk about blessing others, literally what that means is we're going to lower ourselves in a way to be a servant to them and bless them. That's barak. That's barak. Now, I want you to see that because Herod is a lot like the world. We, just our nature, want to elevate ourselves. We want to be the most powerful we can be, the most successful we can be. We want to be up here. I mean, we might not admit it out loud, but we'd rather be served than to be the servant. And Jesus comes, and he says, my kingdom is completely opposite of the world's. Yeah, Herod over here, he wants you to come and bless him and be lower than him, and he wants to sit on a throne above you, and you serve him. But see, Jesus said, listen, you come and you serve others. You bless them. You get on your need and be a servant. So in that throne room, you see a picture of the world's idea of power. Everybody else, you bow down to me. I'm the best. You understand your place. I understand mine. Now, this picture right here is a synagogue on Masada, a synagogue. You can tell, and I have a better 360, but I'm not going to get into it just in the interest of time. You can tell it's a synagogue because it has a few features. I want so badly to do a synagogue lesson with all of you. We did some incredible synagogue lessons, and I hope I have time to do that. But there are several features of every Jewish synagogue, okay? You see three of them here. And the ones you see are this. You see what we're sitting on? Anybody know what those are? The people here sitting around the sides. Anybody know what those are called? They're called chief seats. Okay, you'll read about it in the New Testament, but they're called chief seats. Okay? They were. So they're in other places. For a Jewish synagogue, though, chief seats had a completely different thing than, say, arenas and theaters, things like that. There were chief seats for the important officials. In a Jewish synagogue, the chief seats were people who were wise. And you didn't appoint yourself to the chief seats. Your community recognized, oh, he's a man of God. And by the way Jews think, you cannot become wise unless you've had a lot of experience. Because experience is what teaches you. So it's not just knowing God's word that you learn to get to sit on the chief seats. It's experience, life experience, okay? Anyway, that's beside the point. But those are chief seats, and I'm hoping we'll get into that in much more detail because it's really something important. You see the things standing up? That's what they call basilica design. Every synagogue was basilica design. It's just a way to make a roof. It's open in the middle. You don't need to know that. But that's how they know it's a synagogue. You see chief seats, and by the way, that's a lot of chief seats. If you look at my 360 picture, it is all the way around. It's multiple rows of chief seats. Most synagogues you go into have like one row, maybe two. These have 4 or 5. Why? Well, we're going to get into why would he have, and that's a question. The scholar said, why would this person that's not a Jew have a synagogue on top of Masada. Now the other thing, by the way, you'll see in this picture, every synagogue has a Torah closet. Now this doesn't look like a Torah closet, but that on the left, they found 2 Dead Sea Scrolls in that room right there, buried. So this was their Torah closet. Just for your information, the scrolls they found were, one was the Ezekiel 37, where the vision of the dry bones, where God's Spirit moves them and raises them up, Ezekiel 37. The other one was Deuteronomy 23 and 24, where God promises Israel that they will have their land forever. So the Essenes, during the revolt, there was a few Essenes up here that we talked about a couple weeks ago. And they brought a couple of the scrolls with them. And they were found right there in that Torah closet. Now, why would Herod, getting back to the question, why on earth would an Idumean who's not a Jew have this and this is a pretty elaborate synagogue. Okay, if scholars are correct, it was very much, it wasn't just thrown together. I mean, it was nice. It was nice, okay? So there's different theories on that, okay? One would be, could have Herod built this for his workers? Maybe Herod really cared about his workers and he says, well, hey, I'm gonna give you a place to worship. That'd be really sweet of Herod. That doesn't seem like Herod, but that would be really sweet. The problem is, it was very fancy. You wouldn't do that for your servants. You wouldn't build a fancy synagogue for your servants. So it's very unlikely it was for them. Now, the more likely scenario is, we talked about Miriam. What line was she from? His wife. She was a Maccabean Sadducee. She was in the priestly line. She was a Jew of Jews. Okay? Now, to understand the story, you have to understand there were 2, Miriam, and there was one other dominant wife that Herod had, and they couldn't stand each other. They were constantly fighting. Why do you think he had 2 palaces? So you have 2 families who constantly want their kids to be the successor to Herod's throne. And they're constantly back and forth. So the thought is, more than likely, this synagogue was because this is the palace of Miriam's Jewish family. Now, and by the way, we know it's not a Zealot synagogue. That's the other theory people's pointed out, but we have evidence that it was built before the Zealots' time, so it's not Zealot. So it's probably Miriam. Now, let me show you the next thing. We're still in the northern palace. This is Herod's bathhouse at the northern palace. Okay. This is his workout room. Doesn't look like much right here, but there's tile floors. He had 2 areas. One was an indoor place for him to train that had a cover, and one was open that he could train. Herod was an athlete. He actually won an Olympic wreath in javelin throwing. Okay, so Herod, he was an athlete. He worked out. In this bathhouse, by the way, there's an underground swimming pool. There's a cool bath, a warm bath, and a hot bath. The hot bath is basically a sauna, okay? You can still see, I want to show you, this is original fresco that Herod had put there. 30-something BC, okay? Still there. This is the fresco. Now, I want you to see some things. This is that bathtub we showed you a minute ago. This right here is the hot bath. I want you to get what lengths Herod went to with Masada, okay? Here's what happened. He raised up the floor on these ceramic-type pillars. He couldn't put them out of bricks, they'd have cracked, okay? He had a furnace, and you can see on the left side of the picture, outside. And that furnace, somebody be out there making the heat, which is also incredible, by the way, because I don't know where they got the wood. When you go there, you will see there's not a tree for miles. There's no water. How could trees grow right there? There's no trees. They imported the beams, the trees, for things like that. That's Herod. He says, hey, I can have this if I want it. I'm Herod. So they raised up the floors. They built a furnace on one side, and heat came under the floor. He had water underneath the floor that made the steam rise. He had pipes along the walls The steam came out of the pipes to make a true sauna. All that went into it just so Herod could have a sauna after he worked out. But that's Herod. That's Herod. So, let me show you the storehouses. This is us walking. This is a picture of storehouses. See these big storehouses right here? You can see some. This is completely excavated. This is partially excavated. And this is just like they found it. Okay? All of these storehouses were completely filled with dry figs, dates, olives, olive oil, and grain. 23 rooms filled with food. 23 rooms. There was enough food to feed 10,000 soldiers for 10 years. Herod had it all put there. Now, when they excavated this in 1968, they found jars of dry figs. You couldn't have paid me to try them, but they did. They got them out. They said they were still moist, and they still tasted really good. So, but that's Herod. Just look at those, and they're big. By the way, this doesn't look all that big, but it goes really far. This is kind of a picture, and it looks like it's real narrow. It's not as narrow as it looks in that picture, at least not to me. So they are huge. Can you imagine all those just full of jars and food? All 23 of them. But that's Herod. Now, this is still in the northern palace. Okay, we're still in the northern palace. Now, this is the view from the northern palace. This is kind of overlooking everything, by the way. Remind you, up over here was, anybody know? En Gedi, the closest freshwater source, 24 miles away. But this was his view. So this is, by the way, this is another view. This is his northern palace throne room. Okay, this is the different palace. You can see how it's elevated. The columns there, he would be underneath all that. You would be out here in the open, okay, if you had an audience with Herod. But I want to show you, remember in Masada, you have that 3-level palace at the far left side. I don't know if you noticed that in the first picture. This is what it looked like originally, okay? This is what it looked like originally, okay? Now, he had a balcony. You can see in this picture. This is where the throne room was. The storehouses are right back here. He had a balcony that he could overlook the Dead Sea and Idumea right there. Can you imagine at night just sitting there overlooking all of that? Now, what on earth is that second level? What on earth is that second level? It is what is called a tholos. T-H-O-L-O-S. It's round. And I've got a picture. This is more pictures from that top. That's what it looks like today as I'm looking down. I'm at the top of the palace, right at the end of his throne room, where his balcony is, looking straight down. You can see how it's round right there. What's a tholos? A tholos is a monument to someone who has died. It's this round thing with a pointed roof. You see the picture of it right here. It's round. It's got a pointed roof. That's a tholos. Actually, by the way, whenever you go, you will be going to Herod's tholos for his death. He has one too. It's at the Herodian, by the way, just so you know. We're going to talk about that later on in a few weeks. But this is, now why on earth would he have a tholos right here? Die. Well, after someone is dead, a tholos is a monument to that person. Okay? Now, why would he have a tholos in this palace? Well, one would think if you killed your wife, you probably didn't really love her that much, but apparently you don't know Herod. Josephus says that after Herod killed his wife Miriam, he had her body embalmed, and he would go out at night and talk to her because he loved her so much. Many think that that second level, that tholos, is the tholos of Miriam, his wife, who he would go out and talk to at night. Now, the third level, the lowest level, you can just see the end of it on this picture right here. And I'll show you this picture again. This lowest level right here, okay? That's Herod's apartment. That's where he lived. 2 stories down on the side of a mountain, all alone, just Herod. Now, Herod lived a life trying to achieve power by putting everybody else down. Let me show you what it looks like down there. You can go down there to it, okay? When you get to Masada, you can go down the steps. This right here is Herod's apartment. This is where he lived and died. Well, he died in Jericho, but this is where he lived, all alone. Okay, you see the original fresco walls. You see some of the plaster that's still there. So you see, this is where Herod lived. Now, he ended up, this is Herod. He ended up being on top of the pyramid, all alone. The most powerful man in the world, the richest man in the world, had everything at his fingertips. And when he died, he didn't trust anybody. And one of his last acts was to kill his own son. Here's a question as we kind of finish. If someone looked at my life, do I look more like Jesus, that I'm here trying to be a servant to others, Barak, bowing myself down in a way to elevate him, to serve other people? Is my life about pursuing his kingdom? Or am I more like Herod, where I'm doing everything in life to try to elevate myself and achieve more power and more money, and it's all about worldly pleasures? Do I live in a Hellenistic worldview where everything is about accumulating and accumulating and accumulating, and I can't get enough? See, it's really important that the Bible says that Jesus and Herod were on the scene at the exact same time, because there were 2 kingdoms at play. There's the kingdom of Jesus that still stands today, or there's the kingdom of Herod, which we just have remnants of. So what model am I choosing? It's Masada. What questions do you have?